virtual colloquium series. Thank you, Sarah, for recording. And we are very pleased to be able to meet virtually. We're even more pleased to be able to meet face-to-face, but thank goodness for this venue. I'd like to introduce to you our speaker today, who is someone who, because of the coronavirus, I've never actually personally face-to-face met, and yet have been working with for the last couple of months now. And so Katherine Cotter is our newest postdoc in the Humanities and Human Flourishing project. She just finished her PhD earlier this year at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, working with Paul SILVIA. Her dissertation was entitled Mental Control of Musical Imagery, Combining Behavioral and Experience Sampling Approaches. When we began interviewing Katherine for the position of postdoc, we were astonished at not only how good of a fit she was for what we thought we wanted, but how good of a fit she was for what we now know that we want, even though at that point we didn't know enough to want it. Katherine has done a number of projects connected to what we're doing in the Humanities and Human Flourishing project. We'll hear about one line of research today with regard to music. She's also done collaborative work in art. So Ruth, welcome, good to see you. So I think that part of it will be particularly interesting to you and to Paul as well, your son, who is the director of the Monument Lab. And so really strong connections between art and human flourishing, both at the individual level and at the collective level. So Katherine has a range of experience in topics connected to the Humanities and Human Flourishing project. We brought her on board particularly because of her expertise with experience sampling methodologies as a part of what we want to do experimentally in the coming years. So without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Katherine. I will suggest that we kind of as a default keep our mics muted, particularly if there's a danger of background noise. I think they're doing some jackhammering construction outside of my window, so I'll keep muted. But I was telling Katherine, Marty, that a sign of a successful talk at the Positive Psychology Center is not necessarily that you got through all of your slides, but rather that we had a good discussion. So feel free at any point to break in with thoughts or questions along the way. And Katherine will talk to us now about tuning the inner radio, musical imagery in daily life. Welcome, Katherine.
Thank you for the lovely introduction, James. So I will just start by saying my internet has been a little funky this morning. It seems to be going all right now, but in my morning class, everyone looked frozen, but nobody was actually frozen. So just something to keep in mind that I may freeze up at some point, but we will all handle it very gracefully together. So like James was mentioning, a lot of my work during my kind of doctoral years was looking at music and specifically musical imagery, especially in daily life. So I do have to admit that most of my work does not necessarily have as strong a connection to well-being as I'm moving more towards now in my work with James at the Positive Psych Center and the Humanities and Human Flourishing project. But I do have a lot more experience on the humanities side of things, so looking at different engagement with the arts and things of that nature. So today I'll be kind of walking through some things related to the musical imagery work that I completed during my grad studies. So let me just get that shared before I forget. Okay. Is it shared successfully? Okay, perfect. All right, so as James mentioned, this will be great as a discussion, and I'm happy at any point to take any questions. You're welcome to just kind of unmute yourself as a question kind of speaks to you. I do have a point about halfway through where I'll transition between focus a little bit that I'll pause for any questions you may have there, as well as, of course, taking some questions at the end of the presentation. But if you have a burning question, feel free to just kind of jump in as you may have it. That being said, I will kind of get started and talk about some of my work. So first, musical imagery is simply the experience of hearing music in your mind that's not present in your environment. So you're not just listening to music. It's something kind of new, it's something different. It may be the playing of a song that you're familiar with, but something that's not present in your immediate environment. And this is a pretty common experience. Most people report having this experience at some point during their lives. Most people have it at least on a weekly basis, if not more frequently. Typically, it's music that is familiar to you. So whatever your musical taste may be, that's probably the type of music that will come into mind in your everyday life. In the research, it tends to be pop music because we often are focusing on college students, and that tends to be the favorite there. But if you have different proclivities, then you're probably imagining something a little bit different. Typically, the study of musical imagery, especially in daily life, has been about the subjective experience. And so colloquially, people may talk about this as being our earworms, which sometimes have a negative connotation, but people do frequently report enjoying this type of mental musical engagement. In some experience sampling work, people say that they have it about 25% of the time when we're using these kind of random probes to capture it. So it's pretty common, so most people experience it, and most people are experiencing it relatively frequently. And so when we think about musical imagery as it's occurring in our everyday life, there's been a few different focuses within the research in terms of what kinds of experience we think about. And so the earworm experience that I mentioned just briefly a second ago is kind of termed in the literature as being involuntary musical imagery. So that's kind of the technical term used within the field, although more colloquially, again, it's termed earworms. And normally this is just kind of the experience of music popping into your mind, it being repetitive in some manner. So you're hearing the chorus of a song over and over, and it's just kind of looping in your mind, or hearing a couple lines from a particular song. People view these experiences both positively and negatively, although the earworm term does tend to have a more negative connotation colloquially, and it typically contains something familiar or something that is recently heard. Another way we can think about how musical imagery may appear in everyday life is within musicians. And so musicians often report using imagery as a rehearsal tool. And so this would include imagining music with the goal of practicing for a future performance. They often report it being a multimodal experience. So if you're a pianist, you may imagine what the music should sound like when you're playing, but you're also likely imagining the finger movements that would go along with that. So it's not just the musical rehearsal component, it's also the kinesthetic rehearsal component. And some research indicates that just doing this mental rehearsal through imagery can result in improvements in your physical performance. Of course, physical practice results in larger increases in your subsequent performance, but even this mental stimulation related to rehearsal can improve your later performances. Less work has been done on the topic of mental composition, but this is when people are imagining music with the goal of generating or refining new music, so the creation of original music. Typically, when we talk about musical imagery in daily life, we're often thinking about re-experiencing some sort of music. So rather than generating music, we're often talking about the re-experiencing. But many composers do say that they use this mental tool as a way to develop compositions. Sometimes it's because they can't actually play the instrument. So in historical times, if you didn't have all the fancy software now where you can just input some notes and hear what it would sound like for a violinist to play that particular melody. If you didn't have access to a violinist at that moment, you would often have to imagine what it would sound like for a violinist to play that melody to determine whether or not that was a good compositional tool or a good compositional framing. And so I've really taken the kind of everyday life component really into heart. And so I'm most interested in these experiences as people are living it in their daily lives. So I'm interested in both kind of the general population, and I've kind of focused on that more specifically than just looking at specialist groups such as musicians and looking at how that's applied. And so before I go any further into the musical imagery piece, I find it helpful to just kind of frame my approach to research. And so my approach is very much in the psychology of everyday life. And so if we think about our everyday lives, perhaps now they're a little less variable than they were about a year ago, but if we can imagine what it's like to no longer be confined to our homes or offices or very few spaces and can freely wander about again, oftentimes in our everyday lives, we're encountering many different environments. Now it may be encountering many different Zoom meetings rather than physical environments. And so for some of us now working from home, if we think about our bedrooms, we likely have some place we're all sleeping. For some of us, it may look like this during the day. Very nice, pristine, neat. For others, it might be a little bit more on that side. So even though we all share this kind of environment of our bedrooms, our personal space in that regard, the exact nature of those environments can be quite different. Similarly, we may all be entering an identical environment. So we're all in this Zoom meeting. If we imagine social gatherings, once we can have those again, if we can even imagine that into the future. Some people will respond to a party with great excitement and great anticipation and are very much looking forward to it. Others may be a little more along the lines of, all right, I'll go, I'll put my face in there for about 10 minutes and I'm out of there. I really hate it. So even the same environment can really provoke different responses in different people. And so one of the things I'm really interested in is how different psychological phenomena really can interact with these different types of environments that we encounter, as well as the psychology we kind of bring to the same situation. So even though we're putting everyone in the same situation, how do people interact with that differently in their own everyday lives? Additionally, one of the benefits of looking at everyday life and using daily life methods is that there's some things people don't have great insight into, and it's really hard for people to report on things retrospectively through a survey, for example. And so in many cases, we just simply lack insight into our behaviors and our experiences. And so if we think about different social media outlets such as Instagram or Twitter, if I asked you how many times do you open these apps on your phone per day, or how many minutes do you spend on there per day, you may have some sense of how long you do this or how frequently. If you never do it, you probably have a very good sense of how frequently or how long you spend on these apps or these sites. But for other people who do occasionally look at Instagram, it can be quite hard to get an accurate read. However, if we're kind of assessing people in the moment as they're encountering these spaces, as they're encountering these experiences, we can kind of get a better read on these things because we're measuring them as they happen rather than asking people to reflect on these processes or these experiences. Sometimes it's just the experience itself is really fleeting and we don't even register or pay attention to the experiences. And so this is a little bit more where musical imagery kind of falls. Just anecdotally, in talking to some participants after completing a study, they said, I never realized how often I have music in my head until I was asked about it a bunch of times. And so when you have these experiences that you do consciously experience, but don't really register as having experience, or they're not particularly memorable, it can be really hard to ask people to reflect on these experiences to understand things. And so although I fully recognize that in-lab work is vital and very important, we still have a lot of knowledge to gain from understanding how these things extend into daily life and how things may differ by the types of environments that we are encountering.
Megan, just to inject something, Catherine.
Yeah.
I have it 100% of the time. Is that very unusual?
So there have definitely been reports of this. Some people have termed it the perpetual musical track, I believe is the term. I've seen some kind of more case study related literature to this. I don't believe in any of my studies people have reported it in every survey where I'm asking them, do you have music in your mind right now? But some people are definitely on that upper limit. And it has been documented previously.
And if I could just chime in, I think Marty could provide another category for you, Katherine, in terms of dream composition. Marty, you might just quickly tell that story about the piano and was it 3 tenors or 4 tenors?
Yeah, so not only do I have what you call earworm, I call it a jingle channel 100% of the time, but I think I have it all night long as well.
Okay.
And there have been 3 or 4 occasions in my life in which it was really a full orchestra. In the case of James, it was something for 2 tenors and piano, which became which I gave to a composer to transcribe, and it became a theme song of positive psychology. But I'm bothered by the fact that I have it 100% of the time. It feels like a form of insanity to me.
Yeah, there's been some work in the medical community on musical obsessions or feeling as though the music has been kind of inserted into your brain. So kind of like on the lines of like hallucinations, so musical hallucinations and things like that. Not saying that's where you fall in the spectrum, but yeah, I do know that there's been some more case study anecdotal pieces reporting, people having this kind of at all times, including during sleep, and
it's particularly bizarre for me since I don't read music. I'm almost deaf, and I've never had any musical training. So it does feel like an intrusion in some way.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, I know there's some work showing that particularly in non-musicians, normally non-music students, just given the sampling that's been done, the greater frequency people have these experiences, the more intrusive they find it. And I'll actually be talking, probably most of my talk will be about the control aspect, so how much control or agency you feel you have over these experiences. I think that's an important piece to consider, especially when we think about these things. It's like, if I want it to be there, then I probably am enjoying it and I'm kind of controlling it and enjoying that. But if I can't control it and it's still there, probably very frustrating, probably very, very irksome.
Well, I've got the Beethoven Triple Concerto now, so it's very, very pleasant, actually.
Yes. Yeah, and then sometimes it's like the music, you're just like, why do I have this in my mind? I remember when I presented some of this in Greensboro, one of the faculty who has like small children was like, I have the wiggles. I have the wiggles in my mind. It's terrible. Please make it stop. And I'm like, I'm sorry, I don't know how. So yeah, content always has a big thing to do with it. I mean, if you're at a store and the music they're playing is something you don't like, you probably don't enjoy listening to that music, even if you do enjoy listening to music more generally. Yeah.
Has anyone tested if it's like said sometimes that if you listen to it for real when you have it in your head, and then it would stop? Is that true?
So there hasn't been that much work examining how we can make these experiences stop when we want them to. This field is relatively young, looking at musical imagery in everyday life in particular. And so one thing that has been found is that chewing gum can help get rid of this. There's been some kind of qualitative work asking people, if you want to get rid of this, how do you try to? And a lot of people will attempt just listening to the song to see if that just kind of satisfies that in some way, because there's some theorizing that part of why we're having this looping and it's continuing to loop is there's a sense of lack of completion. And so if we kind of complete it, then that will be satisfied. We're no longer irked by that like lack of completion in a sense. So I do know that's something people will engage in. Sometimes they try to deliberately think of something else, but then fall trapped into that kind of like white bear kind of syndrome, where it's like, don't think about the white bear, now all you can think about is the white bear. So sometimes it, the kind of ironic mental control, I think is the
Unlike white
term.
bear, I can typically change it just by listening to another piece of music in the real world. That usually displaces it.
Yeah, there just hasn't been any evidence thus far looking at if certain methods of doing it is effective. So there's more and more experimental work coming out and being developed now, but a lot of it has really been descriptive thus far. All right. Yes, good discussion. Yay. All right. So just as a brief kind of overview, I just want to make sure everyone's kind of on the same page with daily life methods, just because all of the work I will be talking about includes daily life methods. So I just want everyone to be kind of clear on this up front. And so the method that I most frequently use and use throughout all of the studies I'll be discussing is experience sampling. And so in the way that I've used it, people are signaled multiple times per day for a week and are asked to respond about their current situation. And so normally for me, it's, do you have music in your head right now? And then a series of questions asking about what that experience is like for them in that moment. If they say they are not, then they are asked some questions about their thoughts. And it's also kind of standard practice to also ask about emotion and environmental factors. I won't be going into that element today, but it's kind of standard practice to collect that. And so in terms of the signaling and what it looks like for my studies, people have an app on their phone that they are using for the length of the study. And a number of times throughout the day, they receive a notification that there's a survey for them to complete. They open the survey and complete the questions therein, and kind of go about their life until they get another signal. And so these surveys tend to be pretty short. They take a couple of minutes to complete. So shorter surveys, but we get more data per person. And different approach in daily life methods are daily diaries, and these are when people complete a single survey per day for several weeks or months. So the time scale on daily diary research tends to be much longer. And people are generally reflecting on their day and whether particular events occurred or how they felt in general. And so typically experience sampling is used for more fleeting experiences, things that are hard for people to reflect on even within that same day, whereas daily diaries are used on things that are a little bit more salient, like did you eat 3 meals today? Did you have a fight with your romantic partner on this day? Things that are going to be easy to recall at the end of that day, but if you were asked to estimate just at one point, how many times in the past 3 months did you fight with your partner, you might have a harder time to do, but it's easy to do on a single one-day time scale. Any questions about the methods before I go on? Just make sure we're all on the same page here. All right, great. So as I kind of got into the realm of musical imagery research, something that I really noticed was implicit in a lot of the research, but no one had really come out and said, is that we're really interested in certain dimensions of these experiences, especially kind of the subjective experience of musical imagery in daily life. And so in my first project, I kind of just said, these seem to be things we're measuring pretty consistently across a lot of different studies, but nobody's really done kind of collectively. And so in terms of the dimensions, kind of the vividness of the imagery, so how lifelike or how much does it sound like the music if it were played for you, the valence of the experience, so whether you're personally enjoying this experience or not the valence of the music itself, if it's positive or negative, whether or not there's any sort of repetitive element. So is the song looping? Do you hear the refrain over and over? Do you hear a couple lines over and over? Or is it like the song is playing from start to finish? and the length. So how long has this been happening? If there is a repetitive element, is it really like a short, like 2-segment kind of element that's repeating over and over, or does it tend to have like a longer time course? And also the mental control. And I'll talk more about mental control because that's really the focus that I've taken in my research, is really this mental control aspect. So whether you feel you have the ability to change or manipulate this experience should you wish to. And so in this initial study, I had a sample of students who did a week of experience sampling. They put up with getting signaled 14 times per day, and they did not kill me, so that was very nice. They got harassed for that long. And during each signal, they were asked whether or not they had music in their mind at the time the signal was sent or they noticed the notification. And if they did, they were asked to report on these 5 kind of elements or 5 dimensions of that experience. If they said they didn't have imagery, we just asked them a number of questions about their thoughts just to kind of control for the survey length. And there's a good amount of variability in responses. And so part of this project was to see whether these dimensions actually had variability in them between people's experiences, so that we could understand, well, does taking this type of dimensional approach really make sense? Or are people always having repetitive imagery or always really liking their experiences? Because then that as a dimension doesn't make as much sense because it's quite constant. And so I will kind of preview that each of these dimensions did have pretty good variability. So it does seem like a dimensional approach in this manner does make sense. And so in terms of vividness, I'm just, in terms of each of these dimensions, I'm just going to give some overall kind of tendencies rather than delving in too deeply into this one project. But for each of the dimensions, people demonstrated more within-person variability, so they varied more between their own experiences than people stably differing from one another. So there was more variability between individual episodes of musical imagery for one person versus more globally.
On vividness, Catherine, do you ask about can they hear the different instruments, voice, if they can decompose of what they're hearing?
For these items, not in that detail, just because the length of the survey has to be manageable. But there were items asking about how lifelike it was and how similar it sounded to the song if it were to be played. So it doesn't ask, can you hear the vocalist? Can you hear each instrument? Do you just hear a melody versus the full harmonies and the full composition? It didn't go into that level of detail.
The reason I'm asking is that on verbal material, we seem to remember the gist as opposed to the words. And so I wonder if people are just hearing the melody, or they're hearing more than just melody.
Right. So in my projects, I have not asked that, but Freya Bayliss in the UK did really decompose, like, what are people imagining, with some really nice experience sampling qualitative research. And so for hers, it really was the melody that people were most frequently reporting. So most people are just hearing the melody without the full compositions. They tended to report that the most salient pieces were the melody or the vocal track, if there were some sort of vocal track. And then I believe the next most common one was like kind of the general timbre of the piece. Yep. Yeah, so in terms of this particular study, people said that they were moderately lifelike and realistic. They weren't like they were hearing the song streaming in their mind, but they said it sounded pretty faithful to what it would have sounded like. The vast majority of episodes were viewed positively. So in contrast to that kind of earworm, perhaps urban myth, most people don't hate these experiences all of the time. Most of the time people are saying, yeah, this was pretty good, I liked it. Most of the experiences people reported do have some form of repetitiveness. generally, not asked in this research, but in other research, people have found that it tends to be like the chorus or just a couple lines rather than really like substantial portions of the song that are repetitive. And most of the episodes tend to be relatively short, so these experiences don't last for a particularly long amount of time. They tend to be little blips throughout the day that are occurring. And so in mental control, there's been a somewhat inconsistency in the literature about, sure.
On duration, do you know anything about onset and offset if it's episodic?
No. Yeah, so I mean, there's been, so are you referring to like if something triggers the response? Is that?
Yeah, or what turns it off? Yeah.
Yeah, so there's not really been anything looking at what kind of turns it off beyond how can I get it to stop and what people do to try to get it to stop, normally if it's a displeasing or a distracting experience. In terms of the onset, in one of the studies when asked like, why are you hearing this particular song? The #1 answer was, I have no idea. So people don't feel that like they have a lot of insight as to why these experiences start, or at the very least, why the experience of that particular piece of music has started. There's been some work suggesting it could be just something you heard recently, and so it's kind of in your brain somewhere relatively recently, or like anticipatory. So if you're going to see a concert in the next week, you may be thinking about that particular artist, and then so maybe a little bit more inclined to hear that. But there hasn't been really any empirical work looking at it. It's been more qualitative, asking people why they think.
I have another question. This
sure.
is sorry, I didn't get in on time, so it's about vividness.
No problem. Yeah.
And what I wonder is whether you had any professional musicians in your sample who could tell you exactly how vivid it was. And I'll since Marty has described his experience, I'll say describe mine, which the most common incident of hearing music in my head is having watched a movie and there's some background music, what's supposed to be background music. I end up paying more attention to it than the movie sometimes. And it just, I said, wow, that is amazing. And it's going through my head after the movie's over.
Yeah.
Now I know enough about music, so I'm curious. I want to know what are the notes, and so I often try to identify the notes in my head to the point where I could write them down, and sometimes I can't. It's an impression. It's vivid enough, but not enough to identify what the notes are. Whereas other times I can come close, and then I sort of try to sound it out on the piano and I get the rest of it, but by trial and error. But in any case, musicians could tell you more about vividness. And were any of them in the sample?
So I did not have any professional musicians. I did have some music students. So all of my work has been with students, just given some of the constraints of being a grad student. Yes. And so I'm trying to remember, I had a continuous measure of musical expertise, including training, just because there are a lot of students like myself who did music through undergraduate, but were not studying music formally as a student. And I believe that there was an association between their expertise level and their vividness reports. In this work, I didn't really drill down to, could you recreate it or something of that nature. I'm trying to think, I know in some of the like mental rehearsal work where people are given like a novel piece of music, asked to learn it either through mental rehearsal, through physical practice, and kind of seeing the transfer there. I don't know that it quite speaks to your point, since they're given the sheet music and not asked to do it by ear, but that, I mean, that's definitely one way to look at vividness, is can people recreate it in some faithful manner?
If they know how to do that at all. So the
Right.
question is, if you can do it with real music that somebody plays, as in ear training, it's called.
Right.
Then can you do it with what you hear in your head?
Yeah, the oral skills class. Yes, I was a music major for about a hot 2 weeks in college, and then it made me hate music, so I switched into psychology, and instead I'm like, I will study it, but not try to become a professional musician in any form.
Yeah.
Yes.
I just was wondering recently about the intergenerational transmission of music in your head. You know, I heard stories about before I was born, when there was a depression and the war, where my family came over and they sang together. So there's a social aspect as well as a meaning. And the thing that I've come back to during this COVID is a song, Look for the Silver Lining. It's a very old song, but I'll read it, just the 4 verses, 4 lines. A heart full of joy and gladness will always banish sadness and strife. So look for the silver lining and try to find the sunny side of life. So that spiritual uplifting is something that comes to me for comfort, or I'll ask people in a Zoom, family Zoom, is there any silver lining, knowing that there's a lot of grayness? And if you see Judy Garland, you'll see her with dishes piled up. So is there something? So I just wonder about intergenerational transmission, because that was a comfort, because I might hear my family singing during difficult times. So, and I have other things to say, but for me, I really appreciate your work. The meaning of that to people, is it soothing at times too, or helpful as well?
Yeah, so there's I think one of the few scales that have been developed in this realm, looking at the everyday experience. So it's focused on just the involuntary musical imagery, so the earworm experience. But one of the kind of factors that came out of their initial development is this helpful in some way to your present, like what you're doing? And a second factor that came out was, I think they called it the personal concerns or something like that, but it's more is the experience related to kind of current states of mind or current like concerns over things. Given the relative newness of the emphasis on everyday musical imagery, there haven't been a lot of focus in terms of connections with hardship, although like I mean the music therapy work is there, of course, and has been there for quite some time, but given the kind of different focus of that, I won't delve into that piece of it. But just given some of the initial work, people do find the experiences helpful at times. They do find that it's related to what's currently on their mind, or if there are certain worries happening, the music relates in some way to that, not necessarily in a helpful way at all times, but yeah, there are some initial findings that do suggest that there is a connection between what's currently going on in our mind and what may be spurring the occurrence of the experience or the contents of the experience at some level.
Yeah, I always learn from it, because I've come out of a contentious tenure track meeting or something, and I'm singing Les Mis about, you know, we will not be slaves again. I'm not singing, but I whistle, and then I say, what am I whistling? And then no one knows, I'm in the file room or something, but I'm saying, what am I whistling? And then I learn about myself that I'm picking a song that embodied how I felt in the meeting, and hopefully no one really read it. I did get tenure, so anyway, that's a good thing. But yeah, so it's been a good connector for me, but I could see where it can be very haunting or distracting to other people too. So thank you.
Yeah, of course. Were there any other questions before I get a little bit more into the mental control piece specifically?
I've got one quick thing that you might get to later. With the affective valence, you're saying that most people enjoyed these episodes. I was just wondering whether they're enjoying the episodes because they make them feel better, or they're already feeling good and then they already have the episode. Or do you have more of these involuntary episodes when you are happy?
So I didn't delve into it at that level. I will say that in terms of this particular study, most of the episodes were an involuntary onset. So people didn't actively say, I want to listen to something in my mind at this moment. I mean, on one of the items, I think I don't remember the exact wording of the item off the top of my head, but it was to the effect of, I like don't want this in my head. I don't like this music in my head right now. And so like a reverse scored, and nobody indicated that they didn't want it in their head at that moment, which was a pretty kind of strong thing given the colloquial kind of understanding of this. We're often like, oh, I hate this song. Why is this doing this? So yeah, I haven't gone as deep into the emotion piece, although I do have it assessed.
Just to
I don't remember off the top of my head the correlations. Yeah.
Underscore Max's question.
Mm-hmm.
Max and Beck and I have been interested in positive prompts. So what sort of, and we've been thinking about verbal things, what sort of prompts will create positivity, particularly in depressed people and the like. And so I think what Max is after here is musical prompts to get people's earworm signal channel going in a positive sense.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't know of any really musical imagery work that can really speak to your point or your question, but I know in the more broad, just everyday music listening literature, there have been associations with people having better outcomes when they, like of their own volition, are using music as an emotion regulation tool. So using similar experience sampling methodologies to explore the type of emotional regulation they're trying to go for. So reduce negative versus increase positive emotionality, things like that. I don't remember the exact findings of the study, but I know that there was like an association of people being able to successfully use it for emotion regulation purposes in terms of listening. There has been some work trying to induce musical imagery through normally just like playing something that in theory is going to have some of the qualities of the earwormy type tunes. So pop music, kind of pace, major, being in a major key, things like that. And have had some decent success in doing so, but the induction piece is definitely one of the newer frontiers for this line of work.
I really like the idea of musical intervention to produce positive prompts. I think that's a creative idea, and if you can get it into earworm form, it might be maintained a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one way to do it, I mean, the most consistently reported kind of onset piece is, I've heard this song recently. So if you have people almost make a positive portfolio or a positive playlist and then listen to it at some given frequency, can play around with the frequency level through different kind of experimental conditions and see if there's increased onset based on the kind of listening to it, to see if it gets those kind of songs in their mind more frequently, as the literature does suggest that, yeah, the recency of hearing it plays a role in kind of having it in your mind.
I remember talking to someone about this induction of mood or etc. positive mood through music, and they were just saying that you kind of have to pick up the person where they are, right? So it's not necessarily about singing a happy song when you're depressed, right? But that if you're in a more sad mood, you will start by something artistically, melancholically, like something that is kind of sad but lifts you up over time, and then you can go to the next level. And I had some people that are selecting tracks of music actually based on that, how you can go up gradually, like the ladder. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah.
And also for
no,
imagery,
that
might be
some good work.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Any other thoughts before I move into the mental control piece a little more?
Well, just to elaborate that, one of the theories of the evolutionary function of music is that it tunes the group. And where tuning the group means something like inducing a common mood. So it seems to me it's very promising to intervene as a prompt here.
Yeah, I mean, if you just think about different social gatherings and the kind of music that accompanies those, or the music played in like grocery stores or shopping centers, they're kind of geared toward keeping you in a, putting you in a certain mindset to buy something or be happy at a wedding or at a kind of party, and be maybe more somber at like a funeral or a memorial service. So yeah, I think some of that congruence piece definitely has promise.
One of our
For sure,
participants in the Humanities and Human Flourishing disciplinary consultations, the music meeting, Sarah, you may remember this, suggested that maybe music listening could be a positive intervention in that if you are musically trained to listen carefully and deeply, then it is absorbing. And so he was hypothesizing that maybe for patients who are anxious or depressed, to practice musical listening could get their minds in a different kind of place. Do you think that musical imagery could potentially be vivid enough that if you if you're encouraged to specifically focus on that earworm, maybe it could alleviate other kinds of issues?
Maybe. So just in terms of kind of their naturalistic occurrence, they tend to be kind of back burner experiences, especially just from kind of just some of my anecdotal conversations with some of the participants who say, didn't even realize I had it this much, or I never like really thought about the music that was popping into my head, and it's really just through being questioned, through being interrogated about this, that it really became more present. And I mean, there would be some participants I would run into like a month or 2 months after they participated, and they would say like, I'm much more aware of it through just being asked about it. So I think it could have some promise, but I think first it would have to be asking them about it a lot just so they become more aware of the experience, and then trying to see if we can shape it after they have that heightened awareness of the experience.
Yeah, maybe that's a place for Max and Marty and Tim to start in terms of just the awareness. And then I'm struck by Ruth's experience, right? So she's talking about being aware of as a way of kind of emotional intelligence, right? And then, and so maybe that kind of an awareness is a first step to the kind of change. But I think I'm mindful that we've got about 10 minutes left, Catherine. I think you're gonna tell us how to tune that inner radio.
Maybe I have a few slides that I haven't gotten to. So yeah, so I'm going to start in on the mental control piece, because I think when I get to at least the second study, it'll kind of start talking to some of the intervention points or some of the intervention ideas that folks were having. And so as I was thinking about mental control, I became particularly interested in this dimension because it's more of a process of the experience rather than something specific to the content of it, comparatively to some of the other dimensions. There's some lack of clarity about what control consists of. So there's been talk of, well, it's involuntary experience, but really involuntary in what sense? And it seemed people were saying involuntary in a few different ways and kind of contradicting themselves because there wasn't any really clear theoretical points to this. And so I kind of separated it out into kind of the initiation or the onset. Did you start this experience because you wanted to, or did the music just kind of pop into your head? But then once the music has begun in your mind, do you do something about it? So even if something starts out of nowhere and just kind of pops into your head, there's still largely the ability perhaps to alter or stop that experience. And so there had been some kind of implications that these two different sides of control existed, but really hadn't been investigated. And so in this kind of initial study I did, most of the experiences were involuntarily initiated, but I was really one of the first to really ask about, well, okay, it started involuntarily, what happened next? Was there any attempts to control, or do you even feel like you can control it? And so what most of my research has been on, kind of beyond just this dimensional structure, has really been on this piece of mental control and what it looks like in daily life. And so first, the place to start is like, well, do people think they could control it? Do they think it's under their control, or do we think it's just kind of, it's there, I'm at the mercy of this music? And if I just ask people, do you believe, or I feel the music playing in my mind is under my control on a 7-point scale, it's pretty mixed. Sometimes people feel very strongly that, yes, this is under my control, I can do something about this if I wished. But other times people are saying, nope, I have no control over this. Perhaps they've tried to exercise control, but really weren't successful. So it seemed like there's enough variability in terms of just perceptions of control over their musical imagery that it's worth kind of probing that a little further. So I think this study may speak a little bit towards some of the things you were mentioning about the kind of positive prompts or positive musical interventions. And so in a follow-up project with music and non-music students, I was really interested in whether I could ask them to change things about their musical imagery experiences as they were happening in their daily life. Nobody had really tried to probe it at this level. Of course, there's the plethora of auditory imagery research that really gets into this in a lab setting, but I was really interested in kind of these perceptions about the ability to change these experiences. And so similar to the other study, I asked them, do you have music in your head right now? If they did not, I asked them, can you start something? So can you purposefully initiate this experience? And for people who either had music going when they were signaled or who were able to initiate a piece of music, I asked them to change different components of that experience. So could they alter the tempo, the key? If there was a vocal component, could they change the vocalist's gender? Or if it was a purely instrumental piece, could they change a primary instrument of that excerpt, as well as could they change it to a new song? And so here I just have on the y-axis the proportion of surveys people reported being able to control the experience, and have it divided out by music and non-music majors. And so unsurprisingly, music majors are better at this. They say they are able to initiate music more frequently, better able to alter the tempo, alter the key, alter the vocalist gender, instrument, and change the new song. So music students are better at this, or at least report a better ability to do this, which is largely very unsurprising. They have greater expertise in this domain. We would expect something along these lines. But something to kind of see is that non-music majors are still able to do this with a decent amount of frequency. So being able to change the key was kind of across the board the hardest manipulation to complete. For the non-music majors, very few of them reported hearing purely instrumental music, and so versus kind of the music majors who reported this with more frequency, likely because their repertoire, a lot of it is instrumental, so it might be a little rehearsal piece in there. But in general, the non-musicians are able to do this with a decent amount of frequency, or at least report being able to do it. So they seem to have a decent perception of the ability to change the musical imagery. And so, James, to your point about kind of making the awareness, it seems that, okay, we can make people aware of this. Maybe they have musical imagery pop into their mind. It's not one of their intervention songs or whatever we would want to term them. People report decent perceptions to be able to change the song to a new one. So even if they have that involuntary thing, you can think about it as kind of in some kind of CBT-esque therapies, it's you have kind of the thought, the undesired thought, or the thought that kind of pops into your mind that you're trying to reframe. You can think about this similarly, like, okay, Don't Stop Believing pops into mind. It's not one of my kind of positive intervention songs, but I have the ability to shift it. So we can think about both kind of prompting it through willful initiation, but also reframing some of the involuntary ones if it's somehow not kind of in line with the intervention or something like that.
I wonder about the default circuit in this context. So one of the findings of the default circuit is it seems to, for some people, cycle all day long, a 1 or 2 minute cycle in which you spend 1 or 2 minutes attending to externals, and then you go inward for 1 or 2 minutes. And, you know, we use the phrase tuning out, interestingly, for that. So I wonder if the musical channel is related to the default circuit, and if indeed our daydreams or what's happening when we go inward has a more salient musical score than when we're outward and listening to a lecture. So I wonder about the involvement of the default channel, default circuit with the
right. Yeah, I'm not aware of any work looking at default mode network in relation to musical imagery specifically. The neuro work has been a little bit more along the lines of kind of what areas light up when we're engaged in musical imagery. It's basically the same as when we're listening to music with a little more frontal lobe and prefrontal lobe action. So in terms of the kind of daydreaming, like mind wandering and their associations with the default mode network, since I know that's been done a bit more frequently, I know in some work that a decent proportion of the kind of mind wandering episodes that are kind of cataloged in daily life are just musical imagery episodes. So a decent proportion of those do engage that. So it's possible that some of those associations could be there with the default mode, but nobody's gone there yet with the musical imagery more specifically. Yeah. Okay. So this was actually my pause point midway through for questions, but it looks like we're about out of time. So I guess I'll kind of just open it up for any additional discussion folks want, because the next piece is a lot more complicated and would take much too long to get through with, I think, a minute left. So I'll just kind of stop here and ask if anyone had any questions. Go to my little question slide, my little earworm on it.
So, Catherine, a question that just occurs to me is, you know, one of the limitations, of course, of daily diaries is that people who are dead are fairly unresponsive. So, to what degree is this musical imagery, do you think, or do you know, an artifact of recorded music? You know, has anybody ever looked at this kind of historically and tried to reconstruct what the experience of mental imagery was before recorded music?
So I don't know. I'm trying to think. I don't know that people have gone. I'm trying to think. I'm like blanking really hard. The composer who went deaf, I'm just like really blanking
Beethoven.
on the name. Beethoven, yeah. I'm just like, don't know why I'm blanking on it. I know there's some like diary letters, etc., talking about him using musical imagery to compose after during his hearing loss. And so it seems like to some extent, obviously these processes existed, but I'm not aware of any kind of non-musician focused work looking at the advent of having recorded music versus having to just consume it through live performance or kind of ad hoc performance among friends singing or what have you. Yeah. That's the only historical connotation that I've kind of encountered. I think there's been like a few similar ones that have kind of reported similar things among kind of historical composers, just saying that they use kind of mental composition or mental rehearsal type techniques, especially if they couldn't play a particular instrument and were like, would this sound good or would this sound bad, kind of heuristic.
I've just got a comment about that. I think the average person, like before recorded music, might have been maybe better at this kind of generation because they have to like kind of look at scores more often. I was reading a book about like Wagner, and people were like they were bringing their scores along with them, even though they weren't musicians, because they just loved the music so much and they could look at it and just it would like come back to them and like read it off and understand it more. So I wonder if they're better at generating it or controlling it.
Yeah, I mean, there's some contemporary research with like musicians having them read scores and then listen to something and be like, does it match or not? And so there's been some of that kind of imagery piece that is similar to that. But yeah, I wasn't aware of some of that historical piece, but yeah, makes sense.
I have the intuition that this is a very ancient channel, and it might be, we've got quite a lot of ultra dia and infra dia circadian rhythms. And I wonder the extent to which what we're hearing in our head takes advantage of different ultradian rhythms, and that the notion of our species as rhythmic goes way back in evolutionary speculation, preceding language and the like. So this question of the maintaining of rhythm, it feels to me like an ancient and important property of the human mind.
Yeah, in some of the work I didn't quite get to, I did look at people's ability to kind of internalize rhythms and kind of ability to like recognize them after hearing them, and people were not good. They were like at about chance levels at doing that. People are much better at kind of internalizing pitch related aspects of music compared to timing or tempo related aspects of music. Both in kind of a couple studies that I've done and kind of the kind of broader auditory imagery literature using more behavioral lab tasks. Yeah.
Katherine, sorry for leaving and coming back.
No problem.
So when Jonathan talked about how he would recall, pay more attention to the music during a film, for example, let me offer my younger son is a composer for film and television. He's very aware of not being too intrusive. And it may be interesting for you to speak with him, especially since his girlfriend is a positive psychology person trained at Claremont. So we have a connection on that side as well. So he actually understands the field a bit, which is kind of cool. He's done some composing for me in some of the work that I've done, but his perspective on it is as if he's one of the actors or part of the scenery, and he's always very careful about being too memorable. He knows that doesn't always work. So it's an interesting, particularly with what Jonathan said, it's an interesting in-between place, and he's aware of a lot of this. So you may, if you'd like, I can connect the two of you up, and maybe that's productive.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, so definitely like where the music's coming from, like the intentions and what's happening is going to differ. If you're like a pop singer or something, like you want to be memorable, you want to be out there so that you make the money and all of those things. If you're part of a larger structure such as a film or a TV show, you have to balance how is the music enhancing the goings on of the scene or what have you, and how do you balance that with the distraction level. I remember I was at a concert a while ago conducted by John Williams of his kind of film music, and he gave like the great story of like Psycho and kind of the iconic music for the shower scene and all of that, and how with the music the censor said, oh no, this is too scary, it's too much, and then they removed the music and they're like, okay, good, this scene's great, go ahead, go for it. And so definitely like you have to balance, like, can the music enhance what's happening and kind of drive that. And I think that's just like a really vivid and relatable example to that, versus sometimes the music can be just too overpowering and you don't pay attention to what the characters are saying or what's happening, and that's the most important part at that moment. So I think, yeah, there's like that delicate balance that you have to walk as a composer.
Howard, I've been listening this week to a lot of Enrico Morricone.
Oh yeah.
And those are scores that completely upstage the movies. So one doesn't remember what the mission was really about.
Well,
but the musical score of the mission just stays with you. And certainly the good, the bad, and the ugly. Morricone is really remarkable. Williams also in upstaging
and Randy
the
Newman
action itself.
And Randy Newman.
If I had to list the composers of great film scores, I would say Morricone's score to Nostromo, which is a series, and it is not intrusive. It is just beautiful if you listen to it, but you don't have to.
I think
he doesn't always.
Gabriel's oboe, the mission, is one of the great pieces of modern music.
It's an interesting area, right? Now, one other little note. When he works with a new director, the director always wants to make the music too loud. He said that's the one universal about all of them, which is fascinating. So he's, as the composer, he's talking them down from presenting his work, right? Because he understands the balance. So and he's done television as well as film, and it's a very different game. So there's a lot there to mine, and he's aware of the fact that there is and curious about it. So
yeah. I know I listen to film scores a lot when I'm doing work. It's beautiful. Yeah.
Well, terrific. Katherine, thank you so much for your presentation. Welcome to the Positive Psychology Center. Thank you for such an engaging presentation that led to so much discussion. Thank you in advance, because clearly research indicates that all of us are going to have greater well-being in the week to come, because we're going to be more mindful of the mental imagery, which is going to help to buoy our spirits in that. So thank you to that as well. Thanks, Katherine.
All right. Yeah. Thanks for coming by. It was great, kind of connecting with everyone and talking about this work.
Terrific. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Oh my goodness.